The whistle of the freight train cut through the icy air of Montana's Bitterroot Valley, a lonely sound swallowed by the endless pines stretching into the dark. It was just past midnight on a frigid February night, and Jack Henderson, a grizzled train driver with 20 years on the Northern Pacific Line, leaned back in his cab, sipping lukewarm coffee from a battered thermos. The tracks ahead gleamed faintly under the moon, a silver ribbon slicing through the wilderness. He'd run this route 1,000 times, nothing ever changed. Until tonight. A shadow flickered ahead, quick and low. Jack squinted, his hand tightening on the throttle. Dear again, he muttered to himself, expecting the usual scatter of wildlife spooked by the rumble of the locomotive. But then another shape darted across the tracks, followed by a third. His headlamp caught them. Wolves? Gray coats flashed in the light, their eyes glowing like embers. Jack's stomach twisted. Wolves didn't mess with trains. Not like this. Jesus, he breathed, easing off the throttle as the pack grew, 5, 6, maybe 10 of them spilling out of the trees. They didn't scatter. They stood their ground, snarling and snapping, their howls rising over the engine's roar. Jack slammed the brake lever hard, the screech of metal on metal echoing through the cab as the train shuddered to a stop. His assistant, a wiry kid named Tommy Ruiz, stumbled forward from the back, his eyes wide. What the hell, Jack? You seeing this? Stay put, Jack growled, grabbing a flashlight and his heavy coat. He didn't know why he was stepping out, instinct, maybe, but something about those wolves felt wrong. Too deliberate. He climbed down from the cab, boots crunching into the snow, and aimed the beam ahead. The wolves didn't budge, their breath steaming in the cold. And then he saw it, a crumpled shape on the tracks, half buried in snow. A man. Tommy, get out here. Jack shouted, breaking into a run. The wolves parted as he approached, their growls fading into a tense silence. The man was old, his face weathered like cracked leather, a gray beard crusted with ice. He wore a tattered ranger jacket, the kind Forest Service guys used to wear up here. Jack dropped to his knees, pressing 2 fingers to the man's neck. A faint pulse. Alive. Call it in, Jack barked as Tommy caught up, fumbling with his radio. Tell M we got an injured guy out here, mile marker 47. Who is he? Tommy stammered, staring at the wolves still circling at a distance. And what's with them? No clue, Jack said, his voice tight. He pulled off his coat and draped it over the old man, trying to keep him warm. The wolves watched, their leader, a massive beast with a scarred muzzle, locking eyes with Jack. There was something in that stare, something that made his skin crawl. It wasn't fear. It was purpose. The radio crackled as Tommy relayed the message. Dispatch says paramedics are 30 minutes out. Sheriff's on his way too. Jack nodded, but his mind was racing. How this guy end up here, miles from any road? And why were the wolves guarding him like some kind of sentinels? He scanned the old man's jacket, noticing a faded name tag stitched into the fabric. E. Callahan, USFS. Forest Service. A ranger, maybe retired. Jack had heard stories about the old-timers who still roamed these woods, but this was something else. The old man stirred, a low groan escaping his lips. His eyes fluttered open, pale blue and clouded with pain. Rusty, he rasped, his voice barely a whisper. Easy, buddy, Jack said, leaning closer. Help's coming. You're gonna be okay. But the old man's hand shot out, weak but desperate, grabbing Jack's sleeve. Rusty, he knew, his head lolled back, unconscious again. Jack frowned, glancing at Tommy. Who's Rusty? No idea, Tommy said, shivering. But look at him, man. They're not leaving. The wolf stood their ground, the big one, maybe this Rusty, tilting its head as if listening. Jack's flashlight caught a glint near the tracks, a small, rusted metal tag half buried in the snow. He reached for it, brushing off the frost. It was a collar tag, the kind you'd put on a dog. Or a wolf. Etched into it was a single word. Rusty. Holy shit, Jack muttered, his breath catching. He looked back at the pack, then at the old man. This wasn't random. Not by a long shot. The wind howled through the pines, tugging at Jack's hair as he crouched beside the old man, the collar tag clutched in his gloved hand. Rusty. The word burned in his mind, a puzzle piece that didn't fit yet. The wolves hadn't moved, their silhouettes stark against the snow, eyes glinting in the sweep of his flashlight. Tommy paced behind him, his boots crunching nervously, the radio crackling with static as dispatch confirmed the sheriff and paramedics were en route. Jack, this is nuts, Tommy said, his voice trembling. Wolves don't just do this. They're wild, man. They don't play hero. These ones do, Jack replied, his tone clipped. He slipped the tag into his pocket and turned back to the old man, E. Callahan, according to the jacket. His breathing was shallow, his skin clammy under the frost. Jack pressed his hand against the ranger's chest, feeling the faint rise and fall. Hang on, old-timer. We're not losing you yet. The lead wolf, the one Jack was starting to think of as Rusty, let out a low, mournful howl that rippled through the pack. It wasn't aggressive. It was sad. Jack's gut twisted. He'd grown up in these mountains, hunted deer with his dad, listened to the old stories about the wilderness. Wolves were smart, sure, but this? This was something out of a damn movie. Headlights pierced the darkness, bouncing along the service road that ran parallel to the tracks. A sheriff's SUV skidded to a stop and out stepped Deputy Laura Gaines, a no-nonsense woman with sharp eyes and a shotgun slung over her shoulder. She strode toward them, her breath puffing in the cold. "What in God's name is going on here, Henderson?" she called, her gaze flicking to the wolves. She didn't raise her gun, but her hand rested on the holster. "Found him on the tracks," Jack said, nodding at the old man. "Wolves stopped the train. Kept him alive, I think." Laura's brow furrowed as she knelt beside Callahan, checking his pulse. "Ed Callahan? Hell, I thought he was dead. Used to be a ranger up here till he retired a decade back. Lives alone out past the ridge last I heard." "Know him?" Jack asked, watching her face. "Everybody knows Ed," she said, her voice softening. "Bit of a legend round here. Saved half the valley from a wildfire back in '98. Tough as nails, but he's been a ghost since his wife passed." Tommy cut in, pointing at the wolves. "So what's with them?" "They're just standing there." Laura glanced at the pack, her jaw tightening. Ed always had a way with animals. Used to tell stories at the diner about tracking wolves, nursing em back when poachers got too close. Guess some of em remember. Jack pulled the tag from his pocket and held it out. "Found this. Says Rusty." He mumbled that name too right before he passed out again. Laura took the tag, turning it over in her fingers. Her eyes narrowed. "Rusty. I remember that name. Ed used to talk about a wolf cub he found half dead in a trap years ago. Raised it till it could run with a pack. You thinkin' that's him?" She nodded toward the big wolf, its scarred muzzle catching the light. "Maybe," Jack said, his mind spinning. "But why's Ed out here now? And how'd the wolves know?" Before Laura could answer, the old man coughed, a wet, ragged sound. His eyes cracked open again, wild with urgency. "Rusty, the cabin, they're comin'." His voice faded, his head slumping back into the snow. "Who's coming?" Jack pressed, leaning closer. "Ed, talk to me." But Callahan was out again, his chest barely moving. Laura cursed under her breath, grabbing her radio. "Dispatch, where's that ambulance? We're losing him out here." Jack stood, his gaze locking with Rusty's. The wolf's ears twitched, and for a split second, Jack swore it nodded like it understood. Then it turned, trotting a few steps toward the trees, looking back as if waiting. "He's trying to show us something," Jack said, his voice low. "You're kidding," Tommy sputtered. "You're not following a wolf, Jack. That's insane." "Maybe," Laura cut in, standing up. "But Ed's not making it 30 minutes unless we figure this out fast. His cabin's a mile west. If he was headed there, or away from it, could be a clue." Jack hesitated, the weight of the tag pressing against his thigh through his pocket. Ed's words echoed in his head, "They're comin'." Who? Poachers? Something worse? He didn't know, but the wolves did. And they weren't leaving. "All right," he said finally, grabbing his flashlight. "Laura, you with me?" "Damn right," she replied, slinging her shotgun over her shoulder. "Tommy, stay with Ed. Keep him warm till the medics get here." Tommy nodded, pale but determined. Jack took a deep breath and stepped toward the trees, following Rusty's tracks. The pack parted, letting him through, their howls rising into the night like a warning or a promise. The forest swallowed Jack and Laura whole, the pines closing in like silent sentinels as they followed Rusty's tracks. The wolf moved with purpose, his massive frame weaving through the underbrush, pausing only to glance back and ensure they were keeping up. Jack's flashlight beam danced across the snow, catching glints of frost and the occasional flash of eyes from the pack trailing behind. The air was thick with the scent of pine and something sharper. Fear, maybe, or anticipation. "You ever see anything like this?" Jack asked, his voice hushed, as if the woods themselves were listening. "Not in 15 years on the job," Laura replied, her shotgun held low but ready. "Wolves don't act like this. Not unless something's real wrong." Jack nodded, his mind chewing on Ed's words. "They're comin'." The tag in his pocket felt heavier with every step, a tether to a story he didn't yet understand. Ahead, Rusty stopped at a clearing. His ears pricked, a low growl rumbling in his throat. Jack raised the flashlight, and there it was, Ed Callahan's cabin, a weathered log structure hunched against the ridge. The windows were dark, the chimney cold, but the door hung ajar, swaying in the wind. Shit, Laura muttered, stepping forward. That's not good. They approached cautiously, Rusty staying at the edge of the clearing, his pack fanning out like a perimeter guard. Jack pushed the door open with his boot, the creak echoing in the stillness. Inside, the cabin was a mess. Furniture overturned, papers scattered across the floor, a rifle lying broken near the fireplace. It looked like a fight had gone down and not long ago. Someone was here, Jack said, sweeping the light across the chaos. Ed didn't just wander off. Laura crouched by the fireplace, picking up a shard of glass from a shattered lantern. Blood, she said, holding it up. A few dark smears stained the edge. Not much, but enough. Jack's stomach churned. He moved to the table, where a stack of old photos had spilled onto the floor. He picked one up, a younger Ed Callahan, grinning beside a woman with warm eyes, a tiny wolf cub cradled in her arms. Scribbled on the back in faded ink, Rusty, June '09. Another showed Ed alone, older now, standing with a full-grown wolf, scarred muzzle, unmistakable. That's him, Jack said, showing Laura the photo. Rusty. Ed raised him. Laura's jaw tightened. Explains why he's out there playing Lassie. But it doesn't explain this. She gestured at the wreckage. A faint sound cut through the silence. A crunch of snow outside. Jack spun, flashlight catching movement beyond the window. Rusty's growl deepened, the pack shifting restlessly. Laura raised her shotgun, nodding at Jack. They stepped back outside, the cold biting at their faces, and saw it. Tire tracks, fresh and deep, cutting through the snow toward the ridge. Someone drove out of here, Laura said, following the tracks a few steps. Big tires. Truck, maybe. Poachers. Jack asked, his mind racing. Montana had its share of illegal hunters, chasing pelts or trophies, but this felt personal. Maybe, Laura said. Or worse. Ed's been off the grid for years, but he knows these woods better than anyone. If he crossed somebody. She didn't finish, but Jack got the picture. He glanced at Rusty, who'd moved to the tire tracks, sniffing the ground with a focus that sent a shiver down Jack's spine. The wolf looked up, locking eyes with him, then took off toward the ridge, the pack following in a silent rush. He's got a scent, Jack said, already moving. We're not done yet. Laura hesitated, then fell in beside him. You're gonna get us killed, Henderson. Or save Ed. Jack shot back, his breath fogging in the air. The ridge climb was brutal, the snow deepening with every step, but Rusty didn't slow. Jack's legs burned, his lungs aching, but he pushed on, driven by a hunch he couldn't shake. At the top, the trees thinned, revealing a narrow dirt road, and a beat-up Chevy truck parked crookedly, its engine still ticking from recent use. Two figures stood beside it, shadowy in the moonlight, arguing in low, heated tones. Down, Laura hissed, pulling Jack behind a boulder. She peered out, her voice dropping to a whisper. Recognize the taller one. Mitch Carver. Local dirtbag. Runs with a crew that's been hassling ranchers, cattle theft, poaching, you name it. And the other? Jack asked, squinting. Too dark to tell, Laura said. But they're armed. Rifles. Rusty crouched low, his pack spreading out unseen in the shadows. Jack's heart pounded. Whatever Ed had stumbled into, it was big and dangerous. He thought of the old man's rasped warning, they're coming. Maybe they already had. We need to get closer, Jack said, gripping his flashlight like a weapon. Laura shot him a look. You're crazy, you know that? Yeah, Jack said, a grim smile tugging at his lips. But I'm not wrong. The ridge was a frozen battlefield, the wind slicing through Jack's coat as he and Laura edged closer to the truck. The two figures, Mitch Carver and the unidentified man, stood oblivious, their voices rising over the rustle of the pines. Jack caught snatches of their argument. Old bastard saw too much and finish it tonight. His blood ran cold. They were talking about Ed. Rusty and the pack had vanished into the shadows, their silence more unnerving than their howls. Jack crouched behind a fallen log, Laura beside him, her shotgun steady in her hands. The moonlight glinted off the rifles slung over the men's shoulders, and Jack spotted a third weapon leaning against the truck, a scoped hunting rifle, the kind used for big game. Or people. We can't take 'em head-on, Laura whispered, her breath a faint cloud. They're loaded for bear. We don't have to, Jack said, his eyes flicking to the darkness where Rusty had disappeared. We've got backup. Before Laura could argue, a low growl rumbled from the trees. Mitch Carver spun, his rifle snapping up. What the hell was that? Probably just the wind, the second man said, his voice gruff, but he reached for his own gun anyway. Jack got a better look at him now, stocky, bearded, with a scar running down his cheek. He didn't recognize him, but the way he moved screamed trouble. Then it happened. Rusty burst from the shadows, a gray blur of muscle and teeth, slamming into Mitch with a snarl that echoed off the ridge. The man screamed, his rifle clattering to the snow as he hit the ground. The pack followed, a wave of fur and fury circling the second man before he could fire. He stumbled back, shouting, "Get 'em off me," as a smaller wolf snapped at his legs. Now! Jack barked, sprinting forward with Laura on his heels. She leveled her shotgun at the bearded man who dropped his weapon in the chaos. "Hands up, asshole," she yelled. "Sheriff's Department, don't move." Jack tackled Mitch, pinning him as Rusty backed off, still growling. The man thrashed, spitting curses, but Jack drove a knee into his back, wrenching his arms behind him. "Stay down, Carver. You're done." The wolves retreated to the edge of the clearing, their job apparently finished, though Rusty lingered, his scarred muzzle glistening with snow. Laura zip-tied the bearded man's wrists, shoving him against the truck. "Who are you?" she demanded. "And what's this about Ed Callahan?" The man sneered, his scar twisting. "Insane shit." "Fine," Laura said, tightening the ties until he winced. "We'll sort it out at the station." Jack dragged Mitch to his feet, the man's face a mask of rage. "You're dead, Henderson. You and that crazy old man." "Shut up," Jack snapped, shoving him toward Laura. He turned to the truck, spotting a duffel bag in the bed. He yanked it open, and his breath caught. Inside were pelts, wolf and bear, stained with dried blood, alongside a stack of cash and a crumpled map marked with red XS. One circled a spot near Ed's cabin. "Poachers," Jack said, holding up the map for Laura to see. "Big operation. Looks like Ed's place was in their way." Laura's eyes darkened. Or he saw something he shouldn't have. These guys don't mess around, means Ed's a loose end. Jack's mind raced back to the trashed cabin, the blood on the glass. They went after him. That's why he was on the tracks. "And the wolves knew," Laura added, glancing at Rusty. The wolf met her gaze, steady and unblinking, like he'd understood every word. Headlights flashed in the distance, back up finally. A sheriff's cruiser rolled up, followed by an ambulance bouncing along the rough road. Deputies spilled out, taking Mitch and the bearded man into custody as paramedics rushed toward the tracks where Tommy waited with Ed. Jack watched them go, then turned to Rusty, who hadn't moved. "Thanks, big guy," he said quietly, feeling a little ridiculous but meaning it. The wolf tilted his head, then let out a soft huff, almost like an acknowledgement. Laura joined him, slinging her shotgun over her shoulder. "You think Ed's gonna make it?" "He's a fighter," Jack said, though doubt nodded him. "But we need to know what he saw." "This isn't over." She nodded, her gaze drifting to the map in his hand. "Those XS, there's more of 'em out there. Ed might have been their first target." Jack clenched his jaw, the weight of it sinking in. Ed had stumbled into a war, one man against a crew of killers, with only a pack of wolves to back him up. And now Jack was in it too. He looked at Rusty, the wolf's eyes glowing in the dark, and felt a strange certainty. Whatever came next, they'd face it together. The hospital in Missoula smelled of antiseptic and coffee, a stark contrast to the wild, snow-swept ridge Jack had left behind. He stood by the window of Ed Callahan's room, watching the first light of dawn creep over the mountains. The old man lay in the bed, tubes snaking from his arms, his chest rising and falling with the steady beep of the monitor. He'd made it through the night barely. Pneumonia, frostbite, and a cracked rib from whatever fight had sent him staggering to the tracks. But he was alive. Laura sat in a chair by the door, flipping through the poacher's map, her face etched with exhaustion. "Sheriff's raiding 3 more sites today," she said, her voice quiet. "Mitch and his buddy sang like canaries once we showed 'em the pelts. Whole network's coming down." "Good," Jack replied, his eyes still on Ed. "They deserve it." The door creaked open and Tommy slipped in, a styrofoam cup in his hand. "Coffee sucks here, but it's hot," he said, offering it to Jack. "How's he doing?" "Doc says he's stable," Jack answered, taking the cup. "Might wake up soon." Tommy nodded, glancing at Ed. "Still can't believe those wolves. I mean, they knew, right? They saved him." "Yeah," Jack said softly, his mind drifting to Rusty. He hadn't seen the wolf since the ridge, but he felt his presence lingering, like a shadow just out of sight. A low groan broke the silence. Ed's eyes fluttered open, cloudy but sharp, searching the room. "Where?" he rasped, his voice rough as gravel. "You're in the hospital, Ed," Laura said, leaning forward. "You're safe now." Ed's gaze landed on Jack, recognition flickering. "You, the train." "Jack Henderson," Jack said, stepping closer. "We found you on the tracks. Your wolves stopped me from running you over." Ed's lips twitched, a faint smile. "Rusty, good boy," he coughed, wincing, then focused on Jack again. "They came for me, the cabin." "We got 'em," Laura cut in. "Poachers. They're done." Ed nodded weakly, relief washing over his weathered face. "Been watching 'em for weeks, killin' wolves, bears, too many. Tried to stop 'em," his voice cracked. "Shoulda known they'd come back." Jack pulled the collar tag from his pocket, holding it out. "Found this. Rusty's, right?" Ed's eyes glistened as he took it, his trembling fingers tracing the word. "Raised him from a pup after Mary died. Only family I had left." He looked up, tears spilling over. He remembered. "He did more than that," Jack said, his throat tight. "He led us to you. Saved your life." Ed chuckled, a dry, pained sound. "Always was stubborn, like me." Laura stood, resting a hand on Ed's shoulder. "Rest up, old man. We'll handle the rest." But Ed grabbed Jack's wrist, his grip surprisingly strong. "Look after 'em, the pack. They're mine, you know? All I got." Jack met his gaze, seeing the weight of a lifetime in those pale blue eyes. "I will," he promised, not sure how but knowing he meant it. Ed sank back, exhaustion claiming him, but the tension in his face eased. Jack stepped away, the tag's weight gone from his pocket but heavy in his heart. 2 weeks later, Jack stood at the edge of Bitterroot Valley, the snow melting into patches of green. The poaching ring was busted, headlines screaming about the takedown, Ed's name a quiet hero in the story. He'd been discharged yesterday, back to his cabin with a nurse checking in, too stubborn to leave the woods for good. Jack had visited, bringing a photo of Rusty he'd snapped that night. Ed had just smiled. Now, Jack scanned the trees, a bag of venison scraps from the butcher slung over his shoulder. He didn't know if they'd come, but he'd promised. A howl rose in the distance, low and familiar, and his pulse quickened. Rusty emerged from the pines, the pack behind him, their coats glinting in the sunlight. They stopped a few yards away, watching. "Hey, big guy," Jack said, tossing the scraps into the snow. "Figured you earned this." Rusty padded forward, sniffing the meat, then looked up at Jack. No growl, no wariness, just a quiet understanding. The pack joined in, tearing into the food, and Jack stepped back, a strange peace settling over him. Driving home, the radio played some old country tune about loyalty and wild hearts. Jack thought of Ed, alone but never truly alone, and Rusty, leading his pack with a bond forged in a man's kindness. He'd always seen the wilderness as untamed, separate from people. But maybe it wasn't. Maybe it was just waiting for someone to reach out. In the rearview mirror, the mountains loomed, vast and eternal. Jack smiled. Some debts didn't need words, just a howl in the night, a train stopped in time, and a promise kept.